Okay, now on to the thin places and the power of hope. As I walked into the darkened room, I was instructed to select a floor mat. When all the mats were occupied, the door was closed, closing off all light in the room. We were then asked to imagine how we would end our own lives by suicide. Whether we would leave a note, how we would conduct the act, who might find us, and how they would react. The year was 1972. This was an exercise of a 40-hour training I was taking to become a volunteer for Switchboard, the local crisis hotline. That experience taught me many things, but one that was especially poignant was the power of hope. Without hope, some may not find a reason to live. In August of 1993, I spoke from this pulpit on the theme, the power of hope, and mentioned 12 different types of hope. My thoughts of 20 years ago. In August of 1993, I spoke from this pulpit on the thin places, In June of 2002, I spoke from this pulpit on the thin places and focused on the process of spiritual searching. My thoughts of 11 years ago. Today, I am combining those two subjects, taking my focus and hopefully yours in a somewhat different direction. The idea of the thin places, as Jason mentioned, is not new. The pre-Christian and Celtic people of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, England had a keen sense for the thin places. Their landscape is littered with monuments, markings, and ruins. One boldly stated, "This is a thin place. This is holy ground." In an article by the writer Mindy Burgoyne, Walking Through Thin Places, she said, "A thin place is simply that, a place where the veil is thin." She goes on to say, describing the meaning of thin places is like describing love, fear, the feeling of holding your newborn, the existence of God. All attempts are feeble and talk is cheap. Thin places can be experienced and described in the spiritual perspective, where the veil between this world and the other world is thin, the other world being the existence of a world beyond what we know. I remember the first time I came to the sanctuary of Fountain Street Church. I had been told about the evil of Fountain Street Church for many years. And yet, sitting in that service, I felt the most spiritual feeling I could ever remember having. Years later, I read a statement from Mahatma Gandhi's spiritual message to the world in 1931 when he said, "There is an indefinable, mysterious power that pervades everything. I feel it though I do not see it. It is an unseen power that makes itself felt and yet defies all proof, because it is so unlike all that I perceive through my senses. It transcends the senses." I believe that feeling I had sitting in the sanctuary of Fountain Street Church 30 years ago was a thin place, where one feels that mysterious power Gandhi refers to. Gandhi himself believed that experience was from God. Thin places are often described as sacred experiences or places, but they do not need to be. Mindy Burgoyne went on to say, "It seems once you've been in a thin place and allowed your spirit to absorb that which transcends the senses, all need for definition ceases. Our spirits learn differently than our minds. All through our lives, we walk through these thin places. Some notice the thinness and some do not. There is in Celtic mythology the notion of the thin places in the universe, where the visible and the invisible world come together in their closest proximity. It is the vocation of the wise and good in this belief to seek such places and find the clearest communication between the temporal and the eternal, or otherwise stated, the external and the internal. Since speaking on this subject in 2002, I have come to better understand the thin places in my life, the connection between the external and the internal. The painful and complex times in life test our intellectual and emotional development as we walk through these places of everyday life experiences and develop a more vibrant spirit. In my talk this morning, I will be referring to the thin places as the emotional connection between our external experiences and our internal experiences. The emotion that is felt and integrated when we internalize this experience. It seems that we learn best through stories, and I would like to share with you some of my own stories, with the hope that these stories will awaken in you your own stories. In my 20s, I moved to Zuni, New Mexico, along with my first husband and my 1-year-old daughter. Zuni is a pueblo of about 5,000 Native Americans of the Zuni tribe of the Northwest. My husband was hired to work in a trading post located in the center of the village. For 5 years, we lived behind the trading post in a small adobe house. Life in Zuni was very different from living in West Michigan, where I had lived all my life up to that point. I tried my best to fit into the culture of this very special village. I gathered information about the history of the Zuni tribe, observed how the people lived, and studied their rituals and their way of life. My little tow-headed daughter soon became friends with the village children, and many of the village women were friendly to me. But my closest friends were non-Zuni, who, like me, came from outside the village. A year after moving to Zuni, my son was born. The government-run hospital, located just outside the village, provided service to the Zuni people only. So I had to go to the city of Gallup, 60 miles away. When I arrived home 2 days later, some of the village women brought me gifts of food. I deeply appreciated their kindness and their friendship. A few months after the birth of my son, my husband became ill with hepatitis and had to go to the hospital in Gallup. One night, I came home late after a long day at the hospital and found all the doors and windows of my house open. As you can imagine, I was a bit frightened by the situation, and before bringing my 2 children into the house, I checked all the rooms to see if anything was amiss. Nothing was, so I brought the children in, closed up the house, and went to bed. The next morning, I discovered a large bundle of sticks by my back door and realized that they were prayer sticks, and the house had been opened to let out the evil spirits that were believed to be in my house and the cause of my husband's illness. This was truly an act of love by the village people for my family. That was the beginning of a thin place for me, a time when I began to connect the external world of my life in Zuni with my internal world. I began to hear the stories of my Zuni friends and to acknowledge that I was a guest in their village and in their lives. I began to understand my minority status in this village and made an emotional connection to their stories. I moved from the external experience of living alongside my Zuni friends to the internal experience of living with them. 30 years after living in Zuni, I had the opportunity to live for a brief time on the island of Staniel Key in the Bahamas. this very small island of about 8 of native residents who lived in the small village. Just as I had done in Zuni, I studied the Stanyoki culture and tried to live in a way that I would fit in, and temporarily forgot that until I went through the thin places, connecting the external with my internal, I would not be fully part of this life. I forgot for a time that in order to connect the external with the internal, I had to experience the stories of my Bahamian friends. A process that required feeling their pain of their stories and better understanding their lives. Not until I felt an internal connection to their stories would I be able to go through the thin places of this experience. I remember well when one of my Bahamian friends came over to my house and said, "Would you please sing 'Does Jesus Care' at our church Sunday, because my son was just sent to prison in Florida." Those were 2 journeys through different cultures that I often say taught me to be a minority, a lesson I value.